Start with oops. A very important and regular word in my messy life. So it's just so lovely to see many people, who've supported me, who I admire, who teach me, who are my friends here. It's a lovely, and in a way, Santa Fe, the landscape, the clouds themselves feel like that in some ways. We always talk about love of place, but I think places can love you back. So a talk. Everything is connected. Everything changes. Seeds spread by many means. Some encase themselves in edible fruit so they can be eaten by birds and excreted on the wing far from the berry bush. Some have their own wings or parachutes, as do dandelions and maples, which travel on the wind themselves. Some explode from the pond, as do wisteria. Some you may have met have a way of transporting themselves in fur or socks. Some are carried away and stored by squirrels whose forgetfulness begets oak forests. Some seeds only germinate when fire sweeps over the land. Sequoias, those largest beings standing on earth, only drop the seeds from their cones when fire comes and melts the resin in those cones. In destruction is their regeneration. Ideas, too, have many ways of traveling, and some ideas that begin in obscurity spread and proliferate and strengthen to become a powerful part of a society. Buddhists celebrate the transmission of the Dharma, of ideas, practices, beliefs, from what my own teacher, Zenke Blanche Hartman of San Francisco Zen Center, liked to call warm hand to warm hand. That is, directly, person to person. Buddhists in this temple and many others can trace their lineage back for 2,500 years of embodied relationship, teacher to student relationships, to Shakyamuni Buddha. This transmission is unusual. It's a gardener's practice of seed saving, cultivation, tending, replanting to keep the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and other treasures of the Dharma flowering over the centuries and the millennia, over and over, again and again, year after year, day after day. But a lot of other ideas are weedy, wild things that fade out or pop up, flourish in cracks or get uprooted and banished. We here are beneficiaries of seeds carried from Asia and sown across the Americas, tended and watered and taken root in this new soil. I want to talk about how some seeds dispersed and germinated and became the forest of ideas in whose shade we bask, the nourishment of our imaginations, the remaking of the very soil of our society over the last several decades. Many of these ideas are new one way or another to our weird, sad, industrial Eurocentric civilization, but some of them are in fact very ancient. Tonight, I want to talk about indigenous and non-Western ideas, notably Buddhism. If I'm here as a scholar, it says to learn stuff, not because I know it, particularly around Buddhism, and to try and figure it out, which I've been doing in the lovely house I have here. So to talk about indigenous and non-Western ideas and the transformations in recent decades in science and society that seem to align so meaningfully with these ideas about non-separation, interconnectedness, relationality, a world of systems and processes rather than isolated objects, more driven by cooperation than competition. If you add up how all these winged seeds have come to land here and taken root, if you add up what these ideas have done to what was mainstream American society, you will recognize that we're living in a revolution, a beautiful revolution, one so vast it's invisible to most people, as far as I can tell. Vast because it's changing our values, premises, assumptions so profoundly that I believe we are dismantling an old civilization and building, weaving, planting, dreaming, writing, sculpting a better one. Invisible first because it's been slow and incremental, which means invisible to those who don't see and remember and think in terms of decades, centuries, eras, rather than days or weeks or seasons. Speed is often seen as a virtue, but slowness as the ability to perceive change over large stretches of time is a superpower. Invisible also, because it's happened in so many different disparate ways that are usually treated as separate. Happened in human rights around race and gender, and the resurgence of indigenous power and presence in science that has shifted radically how it defines humans, nature, and the relationship between humans and nature, in environmental perception and action, and in spirituality, and in the influence of Buddhism in the West, and beyond the actual percentage of those of us who might call ourselves Buddhist. The word revolution originally just meant to revolve, like how the moon revolves around the earth around the sun. So maybe revolution is also in the sense of turning back towards some things we lost, as well as forward to some things we want and need and are still trying to invent or are inventing as we go. Because this has been in part a recovery of what was lost when indigenous, traditional, and land-based worldviews were shoved aside, dismissed, forgotten, as well as the creation of new ideas about equality, justice, inclusion, democracy, though sometimes those were old ideas too. But I'm a storyteller, so let me tell it as stories. Once upon a time, there was a bodhisattva named Rachel, who from childhood took refuge in the natural world and made all the living things around her into her sangha. I call her bodhisattva because she would, as she matured, become a scientist, see the harms done to the natural world, would set out to do her version of saving all beings. I am, of course, talking about Rachel Carson. And here I just want to interject a footnote, which is my dear friend Joe, a poet and arborist who grew up in this town, wants to change the name of Carson National Forest to Carson National Forest, i.e. from Kit Carson to Rachel Carson, which I think we're all going to work. You're all with me, right? We're going to work on it after the election, am I right? And they don't even have to spend any money changing signs. Sometimes you can change everything with nothing visible. So, well, the simplest way to describe Carson's chief achievement is to say that she wrote a book called Silent Spring, published in September of 1962, that describes the harm pesticides does, particularly to birds, insects, us, and all nature. That book actually does something much more complex than is usually accounted for. The people spreading pesticides operated with a worldview that was simpler than reality, which is always a dangerous thing. They weren't wrong that you could kill insects regarded as pests with these poisons, but they were oblivious or indifferent that the killing didn't stop there because everything is connected. The poisoned insect was eaten by a bird that became poisoned too, and often that bird was a predator who'd keep the insects in question in check, and so it went up the web of life. Or the poison drifted as it was sprayed to hit unintended targets. It showed up in the water, the soil, the human food. It thinned the eggshells of predator birds so much they broke before they hatched, and it kept on killing. Carson's argument may sound just right in this room. Her argument was that everything was connected, that while laboratory science could create new poisons, field research science told us that you couldn't separate out one thing in the environment this way. The poison didn't stop at its target. It kept on moving and migrating and poisoning. She described a world of relationships, of many life forms woven together. 6 months after Silent Spring appeared, Martin Luther King would say in his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, where he was for trying to liberate his people, to make this society better, where he was because he was arrested for trying to do that. And he wrote that we human beings are all woven together in what he called an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny, a phrase so beautiful, so poetic, and so powerful. I think I need to read it twice. An inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. This is what I mean about the invisible revolution. Pesticides and racial justice are in any ordinary way pretty far apart, but the objections Carson and King mounted were objections to separateness, to the refusal to see connections and consequences in relationships. To give you a little chronology, in February of 1960, while Carson was writing Silent Spring, the whites-only lunch counter sit-in protest by Black students in the South began. That same year, Thich Nhat Hanh first came to the United States to study and to teach. In 1964, he founded the Order of Interbeing, a word he coined himself to describe that relationalness, that single garment. The Earth's vegetation is a part of the web of life, Carson wrote, in which there are intimate and essential relations between plants and the earth, between plants and other plants, between plants and animals. Sometimes we have no choice but to disturb these relationships, but we should do so thoughtfully, with full awareness that what we may do may have consequences, remote in time and place. As we have seen, soil and the living things in and upon it exist in a relationship of interdependence and mutual benefit. Presumably, the weed is taking something from the soil. Perhaps it is also contributing something to it. Interdependence, interbeing. There are echoes and analogies through all these things happening in that period. She told a story. She told a story of how the Forest Service sprayed 10,000 acres in Wyoming with a herbicide that was supposed to kill sagebrush to turn the Bridger National Forest in Wyoming into better grassland for cattle. But the poison also killed willows that grew alongside the streams. And when the willows died, the moose and the beaver vanished. And when the beaver vanished, so did their dams that had created lakes and slow streams and small rivers. And with the lakes and rivers gone, the trout vanished too. None, she wrote, could live in the tiny creek that remained, threading its way through a bare, hot land where no shade remained. You get rid of what you don't want, and you lose what you want because they're not separate. A few years ago, I was having dinner in San Francisco with somebody who's become a wonderful friend, the West Virginia climate leader, Marianne Hitt, who, with the Sierra Club, led the Beyond Coal campaign that shut down several hundred coal plants, prevented others from opening, and speeded the transition away from the fossil fuels, destroying the climate and our future. In fact, just this summer, we suddenly reached an extraordinary milestone where more electricity is now produced by wind and sun than by coal. Transformation that was inconceivable 20 years ago when renewables were expensive and utterly inadequate to give us the energy we run all these things, including these lights and this amplification on. So Marianne and I were sitting in a restaurant facing San Francisco Bay, and these beautiful flights of brown pelicans went by. And brown pelicans, like eagles and osprey and a lot of birds way up the food chain, were really threatened with extinction by DDT, the pesticide Carson focused on the most. It was the banning of DDT that let them rebound. And so though Rachel Carson died of cancer in 1964, when I saw the pelicans, I told Marianne that we were also looking at Rachel Carson, that she's with us in all these birds. So she faced attacks from the chemical industry, much trying to mock and dismiss her as an emotional or hysterical woman, though she was as much a scientist as the industry men who tried to take her down, or perhaps more of one. 4 years after Silent Spring, another scientist wrote a paper rejected by about a dozen scholarly journals before it was published in 1967. If you think of all the other things that were happening in 1967, those of you who are old, actually, those who are young might have heard about them. It was a long time ago now. But the scientist's name was Lynn Margulis, and her theory of endosymbiosis proposed that the kind of cells that make up everyone in this room, make up fungi, plants, and animals, evolved from a primordial merger of two radically different kinds of cells. It was in a way antithetical to Darwinian ideas that life primarily keeps splitting off, separating, competing, and it said that sometimes we don't come apart, sometimes we come together, sometimes we don't become more different, sometimes we become one. Margulis noted that sometimes life merges, works together. She said that while the scientists around her tended, quote, to believe that some species diverge from one another, I claim that, more important in generation of variation, species form new composite entities by fusion and merger. Symbiogenesis, she called it, an extremely important mechanism of evolution in her theories, challenged very much at the beginning, almost universally accepted at this point. Symbiogenesis, to generate through symbiosis, through cooperation, through coming together. A spectacular example, like those of you with eagle eyes could probably see out the window, is lichen, which you may notice on the rocks and trees in the hills around here. Lichen is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae or a cyanobacteria, which aren't just different species, but from different kingdoms of life altogether. Pardon the technicality. The thing you want to hang on to here is the idea that life is not an incessant war over scarce resources. In these new scientific visions, sometimes it's a party, often it's a cooperative, finding the best way to share and increase the abundance, including the abundance of relationships. Lichen is the very essence of interbeing. Make love, not war, went one of the slogans of the 60s. And Margulis found something we could call love in the form of this mutuality, relationality, interdependence. Maybe the new biology is also a make love, not war set of ideas. It gives us a version of nature, including our own nature, that is more cooperative, collaborative, complementary, connected. It's really exciting to have Molly Crockett here, a neuroscientist who works a lot with Roshi on the nature of our consciousness, our moral character, our troubled relationship with tech and machines. And that field has also found so much about, I think, a lot of inherent empathy, cooperativeness, connectedness in how we are, which I will not expand on because, first of all, I'd be embarrassed in front of her. And second of all, it's not part of the research I did for this, which is actually kind of preparation for a book I'm going to do, but I'm just in the gathering phase of not even the seed planting. So, but there are so many of these stories. In 1960, when the lunch counter sit-ins were happening, when Rachel Carson was writing that book, a young English woman amazingly found support to go study chimpanzees, and as they'd never been studied before in the wild. And so she went to the forest of Eastern Africa. And what Jane Goodall observed and shared with the world in her book, which came out the same year as Lynn Margulis's paper, I love these chronological things. It really shook the scientific world. There was this very weird idea that humans were very separate from all other animals, that the brute creation, as I think Christianity used to like to call it, they didn't have emotions, they didn't have this cooperation, they didn't use tools. It was this really reductive sense of animals as so far apart from us. And of course, Goodall famously observed all these things among the chimpanzees, these complex social relationships. And it was just one of the many ways that the separation, the whole idea that nature and culture, humans and nature are so separate, that breach began to be bridged with ideas as well as with feelings, with science as well as with sort of ethics and philosophy. So, and this process continues and continues. You could go up through Suzanne Simard, who also faced a lot of rejection for her really landmark co-authored paper that recognizes forests are not species of trees, in her case particularly, I think it was aspens and some kind of conifer competing for each other, but actually sharing resources, communicating that a forest wasn't a bunch of individuals each trying to get more, but a cooperating society. And more information about kind of plant intelligence and interaction has been coming out, particularly in a fabulous new book I recommend called The Light Eaters by Zoe Schlager. So, and these chronologies, and you can see it all building. San Francisco Zen Center is founded in 1962. In 1963, Roshi's teacher, Bernie Glassman, goes to a Zen temple in Los Angeles on the beginning of his path into Buddhism. In 1964, the Wilderness Act and the Civil Rights Act both are passed into law in this country. And while obviously incredibly different, which is what I think would be the normal assessment, to me, they're also subtly similar Each extends protection and rights to beings who'd been under attack. Each recognizes value where it had been hitherto denied. In 1966, Martin Luther King Jr., at Thich Nhat Hanh's urging, came out against the US war on Vietnam. That year, the National Organization for Women and the Black Panther Party were both founded. So you see this incredible generativeness. Stuff is happening in all these different arenas. It's obviously not correlated in any intentional or conscious way, but I think there's a common denominator. Some of it could be summed up when the environmental scientist Barry Commoner wrote the 4 laws of ecology, of which the first one is everything is connected. So movements founded in this era for women, queer people, indigenous people, Latinos, Asian Americans, and people with disabilities would insist on their rights to full participation, respect, and equality. All of them transformed the status of their constituencies profoundly. And of course, in none of this am I talking about like, and then it was great, and then they finished the job. We're in the middle of a revolution, not at the end of it. And, so one of the things I love about the Mahayana Buddhist lineage is the bodhisattva vow, the vow not to try and transcend this earth and escape the wheel of birth and death, but to stick with it, to help awaken and liberate other beings, to keep coming back. So the work is not ever going to be finished in any time frame practical to all these things I'm talking about. So these things are not finished, but they're so well begun, and all of our lives are so profoundly different because of them. In the 1960s, the dominant worldview of industrial capitalism, of white supremacy, of patriarchy, and the domination of nature was being unraveled from all directions. I think of it a single garment of shitty destiny, and people kind of pulling at the threads to knit the yarn into something better. If you can picture this sort of the great unraveling, for the great reknitting. It's always dangerous when I wing it. So, but divide and conquer was the reigning ideology, but other ideologies were migrating, multiplying, evolving, and seeking to disman the separateness and the inequality. That's the revolution. You're part of it, and it's changed your life and thinking. It certainly changed mine. The extraordinarily bleak circumstances of women in the world I was born into have been profoundly changed by feminism. And thanks to all those who came before me, I have an infinitely better and different life. Ecological thinking and the rise of indigenous voices, or, they never went away, the willingness of white people to let them be heard, particularly starting after the quincentennial of Columbus's arrival in 92, really profoundly, along with Buddhism, changed my thinking. We live in a different world. So all of us stand facing a whole new world being made that is maybe also an old world being reclaimed, the forgotten, the neglected, the unvalued, invited back in. I consider it breathtakingly exciting. And even as a climate activist, even facing the devastation and destruction every day, I'm also incredibly excited about what's happening about the climate movement, the climate solutions, the fact that to address the climate, to recognize this crisis is to recognize that everything is connected. What comes out of our factories, our power plants, our tailpipes, if it's fossil fuel driven, which it doesn't have to be anymore, thanks to the energy revolution, but it goes up into the sky, it thickens the insulating layer, which warms the planet, which creates the climate chaos, which gives us the terrible floods and fires and heat and famines and migrations and extinctions and all the other things we're facing. So, but how do all these pieces fit together? Somehow by the 1960s, American life had become far more open to other worldviews, would be a conventional way to say it. But another way would be to say that through great dedication, diverse outsiders had opened the doors and come inside with new ideas. Somehow a lot of the new ideas had in common a greater inclusivity, a greater equality, a greater sense of interconnection. And all this began to dismantle from many directions. The emphasis on individualism and the normalization of many forms of inequality and separateness, all of it demonstrated that we are indeed woven together in a single garment of destiny, whether you're talking about humanity, ecology, climate, So, and I know politics don't get talked about that much in this room, but they invited me in, which is always always inviting trouble in, which might be my middle name in a John Lewis good trouble way. And here I might say, here's a sign of the revolution. Somewhere in the South, somebody shout out if you know the state. They just took down a Confederate statue and replaced it with a sign of John Lewis, the great civil rights leader, who led people across the Edmund G. Pettus Bridge and got his skull cracked for it, and then became a great force in Congress, who died a few years ago. But so last night, some of the people who are here in this room and I watched the Democratic Party's roll call of all the states pledging their votes. And it was this beautiful thing in which each, they had a DJ, they had all this amazing music, mostly Black music, and there was all this energy and joy and liveliness and rowdiness, which is not unusually. It's tedious bureaucracy, it's kind of dreary. It was amazing. How many of you watched it? And it was so lucky you. The rest of you can go to YouTube. It's so the South Dakota speaker started speaking in Lakota before he turned to English to pledge those votes. People talked about what was wonderful about their states. There was this kind of local pride and love of place from every state and a bunch of territories. And all this great music brought this joy. And so I wrote this morning, and here we are, reaping the fruits of seeds we planted, though we never dreamed there would be a harvest rather than endless diligent sowing and tending. Something shifted this summer, or rather something shifted so gradually no one quite perceived it until we saw clearly and almost shockingly, not with the nomination of Kamala Harris, not with her stepping forward with confidence and charisma, but with how she was received. I really feared that as a candidate, she'd meet yet again with the racism and misogyny I'd seen before in her case. I'm a San Franciscan. I voted for her 6 times already. She's won every race, but I've also seen a lot of attacks on her. And I really worry that this is going to be kind of a miserable Black person being torn down. It was completely different, and it made me feel like our whole society had changed. The reception of her made me feel like I lived in a better country. It was, and she's great, but that better country was what really moved me the most about it. A country ready to be more equal, more inclusive, more creative in its sense of self. A country that has changed in the subtle, slow increments through a million things that might not seem like much individually, but add up. Enough grains of sand to make an entire beach, enough trees to make a forest of change. And the world I was born into is inconceivable a woman or a Black person could be a major party's candidate for the presidency. We live in the past's inconceivable future, and it's our job to be the good ancestors who will make the unimaginable futures yet to come, or rather the best things in them, to plant the seeds generations to come will harvest. So I feel like we're harvesting those seeds right now of feminism, the civil rights movement, of a lot of justice, of a lot of anti-racism, of a better and more inclusive vision. So Anon Juraharadas, I just put an extra syllable in. I need Juraharadas wrote of last night. Above all, the party followed messaging guru Anat Shankar Osario's formula that you have to paint the beautiful tomorrow, meaning that it wasn't lecturing anyone about the world. It showed what it feels like when that better world comes. And it really felt like that for everyone over for dinner at my place, this kind of joyful, inclusive, room for everyone energy, the sense of abundance that there's enough to go around, we can share, we can include. We see things when we're ready to see them. Although non-native recognition of native worldviews has been plagued by appropriation and intrusion and oversimplification, something remarkable has happened in recent decades. A migration of ideas, a planting of seeds, the idea of a relationship to nature that is neither alienated nor destructive. I was present in the early 1990s when the white-dominated environmental movement was beginning to recognize that places described as wildernesses were in fact somebody else's homeland, which is so profoundly transformative. The 1964 Wilderness Act described wilderness as a place in which man is only a visitor, which I always used to joke didn't say anything about women. and maybe children. But it really did suggest that nature was a place human beings didn't belong in, because the only way we could be in them destructive, which could sort of make sense if you consider white settler colonialists in North America the only template, the only people who'd been there. But of course, this continent has been inhabited for millennia by people who didn't fuck shit up. And, near so much. And I know you all like it when I curse. Students love it too. It's speaking of opening doors. It's so in the recognition that these places formerly thought of as wildernesses had been homes loved and tended by human beings for millennia, really began to undermine the whole idea that nature and culture were separate, that the only way human beings could be in the natural world was destructive, so we didn't belong there. And it also transformed the environmental movement from what it had been. Really, the conservation movement was about putting fences around exceptionally pretty and amazing places, really with kind of a mandate like what I think of as a kind of virgin whore dichotomy. This place we won't touch, this place, we'll strip mine and pollute and, and develop. But the environmental movement's different than the conservation movement. The conservation movement really was about separation, putting fences around things. The environmental movement recognized that you couldn't, that nuclear fallout, pesticides, fossil fuel emissions, in the ugly way, migratory species, air currents, weather, all don't recognize boundaries and borders and fences and walls. And so, an environmental movement, as Barry Commoner said, really recognized that everything is connected and everything really began to change in earnest. So this has had real consequences. And I think my wonderful friend Catherine is here. I came back to New Mexico, where I actually spent the first 2 years of my life here, came back as an adult, although we used to visit Albuquerque cousins, came back as an adult in 1989, essentially got driven straight to La Fonda, walked straight in, met my friend Catherine Harris, who has been one of my great friends for 35 years. And we were hanging out. She's a brilliant, kind of a visionary landscape architect. And I realized, and this is a metaphor running all through this talk, I think we really thought of ourselves as diligent people who have to keep planting seeds and hope that something grows and water it and tend it and fertilize it. And I realized that what we don't really think about is this stuff is actually going to bear fruit. There's actually going to be a harvest. And I think in some ways, with what I saw last night, with some of the beautiful changes that are actually happening, there is a harvest. The work is paying off. We have to keep doing it. There have to be more harvests. We need to change a whole lot more, especially around climate, and not to neglect everything else. But those seeds are bearing fruit. And that's part of my excitement in this era. So, and I think the shift in non-Native people recognizing and finally kind of respecting Native people is also bearing fruit. In California, where I mostly have spent my life, there's real land back happening in a lot of different ways. A few years ago, the Save the Redwoods League, which was founded as a kind of eugenicist organization pretending the old white waspy people were natives somehow, like redwood trees, and the riffraff should stay, the ethnic whites, let alone non-white people, should stay out. A few years ago, they really, oh my God, my favorite toddler in New Mexico is here, the hot baby. And the Save the Redwoods League published a deep apology for its eugenics, its racism, et cetera. And they bought a 500-acre old growth redwood forest and gave it to the Sinkyone Tribal Coalition to manage. Just this year, 4 dams were taken off the Klamath River, which is being managed primarily by the Yurok tribe. So for the first time in 100 years, 100 miles of river is running free. And the salmon, which are such a deep cultural part of Northwestern California, the salmon can swim all the way up as they had for millennia before those dams came in. This is what the harvest looks like. And it comes partly out of listening to those Native voices, out of respect, out of relationship, out of understanding the ecologies, out of being in a world that would be kind of inconceivable in so many of these ways to people, even environmentalists 50 years ago. So as giving land back to Native people, we were still in the process of taking it away in so many ways. So, and we are running out of time, and I am a wordy person in case you hadn't noticed it yet, and we're going to skip a few things, and I'm just going to much to Roshi's relief, wind up. So. So, and obviously these shifts are not universal. There's a huge amount of pushback. What I've called Make America Great Again, MAGA, all along is Make America 1958 again, except when it's Make America 1858. It's essentially people, I think, deeply driven by a sense of scarcity, that there's not enough for everybody, that, the idea there's not enough for men if women have rights, there's not enough for white people if non-white people are included, there's not enough for Americans if we let the refugees we've helped create with our wars and our climate emissions in. There's not enough if we protect the land. There's not enough if we stop extracting fossil fuel. But we actually live in a world of tremendous abundance. And something that came up sometime on this visit is when Sitting Bull's tribe was defeated, he went on tour with Buffalo Bill's Wild America, and he made a lot of money signing photographs of himself to sell for $1 a piece, but he came home with no money because he gave it all away to the hungry city urchins, the white kids who were peeking through the tents. They didn't have the money to come in, but they wanted to see. And so then he was asked for his opinion on, kind of the white man, as people used to like to call it. And he said, the white man is good at production, but bad at distribution. Which I thought was like everything you ever needed to know about capitalism in a certain way. That there is abundance, but we have a distribution problem. With everything, there is enough to go around, which I think is partly about the interbeing, the interconnected vision, a vision of generosity, a vision of compassion for all beings. And so these shifts are not universal, but I truly think this is a backlash. These are people who are frightened by the world changing. And I'm hoping with all these Republicans for Harris, we can welcome a lot of them in, that this is a phase that maybe we're going to exit. So, but I still believe that we're in the midst of a great revolution, a great turning, far from the end, insofar as anything ever ends. But helping the turning is the job of us all, turning away from destruction of the climate and the earth and the vulnerable, turning towards compassion, inclusion, and the awareness that everything is connected. Turning towards a new worldview in which humans are not ruthlessly competitive individuals, but deeply social beings who survive, as we always have, in truth, by cooperation. My friend David Graeber once said that everything is socialism and capitalism is just the worst way to do socialism. But at its heart, we see that we were never separate. Each of us sitting here, our bodies are about 70% water, more or less. We are liquid sloshing around in skin bottles so we can pretend to be solid until we get thirsty or have to pee. The water that comes out of the faucet here mostly comes out of the Santa Fe River and the Rio Grande, whose waters in turn came from the tributaries fed by snowmelt and rain, which is to say from clouds, from northern New Mexico's sublimely beautiful clouds, which is part of what always brings me back. And the clouds themselves often came from evaporation over the ocean, and ultimately from the endless water cycle of water evaporating, rising and falling and flowing. The water is more ancient than life itself. The waters in which life emerged, the great waters in which the cyanobacteria, 2.7 billion years ago, began to produce through photosynthesis the free oxygen that altered the atmosphere so that aerobic, that is oxygen breathing, life could evolve, including ourselves. Every breath you take is a gift of oxygen from trees, grasses, and ocean-borne organisms. That breath we watch so carefully in the Zendo is another reminder we were never separate, since we cannot live for more than a few minutes without taking in oxygen, and the liquids, solids, gases, ideas, words, love, flowing in and out of us, are further reminders that we live in the constant interchange that is also change itself, and that we ourselves are as much processes as objects. An object is imagined as stable and separate, even sealed up, but a process is a constant state of becoming that is also a constant interchange with what is beyond. Think of Kamala Harris laughing as she quoted her mother. And her mother said, I don't know what's wrong with young people. You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you. And I know that thanks to Molly Crockett here, who made a t-shirt out of it, which I want, which says, I exist in the context. We all do. We exist in the context. We are each other's context. The trees, the skies, the water, the climate are our context. We are flows, we are processes, we are exchanges, we are knots in the great net, droplets in the river. An early student of Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, who founded San Francisco Zen Center, once shamefacedly asked him nevertheless, if he could sum up Zen in one sentence. Without missing a beat, Suzuki Roshi said, everything changes. He expanded on it elsewhere, saying, the basic teaching of Buddhism is a teaching of transiency or change, that everything changes is the basic truth for each existence. No one can deny this truth, and all the teaching of Buddhism is condensed within it. This is the teaching for all of us. Wherever we go, this teaching is true. This teaching is also understood as a teaching of selflessness, because each existence is in constant change. There is no abiding self. In fact, the self-existence of each existence is nothing but change itself, the self-nature of all existence. What I'm interested in here are the relationships and in the worldviews that encourage seeing these relationships, seeing process and flow rather than separate objects. What I'm also interested in here is the ways that separately a lot of ideas, movements, worldviews became more powerful, influential, and even transformative around the same time. The way together they are dismantling the old world we've inherited and building a better one, a more compassionate one more accurate and perceptive about the realities, social and scientific and ecological around us, more inclusive and more egalitarian, more capable of addressing the climate crisis and the human rights crises. One of those forces is Buddhism. And at the core, there are some ancient ideas that align beautifully with what I've been talking about in regard to new science and new social values. Dependent co-arising, I could mention, that phenomena exist in relationship to other phenomena, not in isolation. That is, everything is in that swirl of processes, that web of relationships, that existing in the context, non-duality, non-separation, and ceaseless change. The great river, a metaphor, even though we have a real river down here. And rivers can teach you that if time and change are a river, it freezes over, it has eddies, waterfalls, deep pools, splashes. And I hope that this wasn't too splashy. It's wonderful to swim a little way in this great river of ideas, of being, of becoming, of transforming with you all. Thank you so much.